August 14, 1945. Okinawa. The air hung thick with the smell of wet earth and scorched metal, a scent that had clung to the island since April when the Americans came ashore. In a makeshift detention compound 3 miles inland from the ruined harbor, a young woman named Sachiko Hayashi sat on a wooden crate beneath a canvas tarp, her hands folded in her lap, her cotton work uniform stained with red clay. She was 23 years old. The war had ended that morning, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackling through radios across the Pacific, words she had not heard herself but learned of through whispers that moved like wildfire through the compound. Around her, 200 Japanese civilians, nurses, teachers, factory workers, all women, waited in silence, their faces masks of uncertainty. They had been told nothing except that the fighting was over. Beyond the barbed wire, American soldiers moved with an ease that seemed impossible, laughing, smoking cigarettes, their rifles slung casually over shoulders as though death had never touched them. One soldier, tall and lean with hair the color of sand, stood near the gate checking a clipboard. Sachiko watched him without meaning to, the way his mouth curved when another soldier said something she couldn't hear, the way he moved as though the ground beneath him was solid and would always be solid. She did not know his name. She did not know that within 3 months she would believe herself in love with him. And she did not know that this love would become the deepest regret of her life, a wound that would never fully close. The Pacific War had taught the Japanese people that survival required sacrifice, that the individual existed only as a thread in the larger fabric of the nation, and that death in service to the emperor was the highest honor a citizen could achieve. For women, the doctrine was both simpler and more complex. They were the guardians of the home front, the bearers of future soldiers, the silent pillars upon which the entire masculine edifice of military conquest rested. Sachiko had grown up in Naha, the largest city on Okinawa, where her father ran a small shop selling rice and dried fish. She had attended girls' school until she was 16, learning calligraphy and flower arrangement and the proper way to serve tea. When the war expanded and swallowed the Pacific, she was conscripted into the Women's Volunteer Labor Corps, assigned to a munitions factory on the southern end of the island. The work was brutal, 12-hour shifts filling artillery shells with explosives, her fingers blackened with powder, her lungs burning from chemical fumes. But she did not complain. Complaint was selfishness. Complaint was betrayal. She had been taught that American soldiers were demons, savage beasts who raped and murdered, who would desecrate temples and burn villages and show no mercy to the innocent. When the Americans landed in April, the factory supervisors distributed cyanide capsules to every woman worker. Death before dishonor. Death before capture. Sachiko had tied the capsule into the hem of her uniform and felt its small weight against her hip like a talisman. But when the Marines came through the factory district, moving house to house with flamethrowers and grenades, Sachiko did not take the poison. She hid in a drainage culvert with 4 other women, pressed into the mud while explosions shook the earth above. They stayed there for 2 days. When they finally emerged, filthy and half-starved, American soldiers surrounded them. Sachiko closed her eyes and waited for the bullets, the bayonets, the brutality she had been promised. Instead, a Marine with a sunburned face gave her a canteen of water and pointed toward a truck. The women were driven to the detention compound, given blankets, given bowls of rice and canned meat. No one was beaten. No one was violated. Sachiko did not understand. The cognitive dissonance was total and paralyzing. Everything she had been taught about the enemy collapsed in the face of this inexplicable mercy. She felt as though she had stepped through a mirror into a world where the laws of nature ran backward. The compound was neither prison nor sanctuary but something in between, a liminal space where the old certainties dissolved and nothing solid had yet formed to replace them. The American soldiers who guarded the camp were mostly young, 18 or 19, boys from Kansas and Georgia and California who counted the days until they could go home. They treated the Japanese women with a distant politeness, neither cruel nor particularly kind, simply going through the motions of their duty. But there were moments, small gestures, tiny fractures in the wall between captor and captive, that hinted at something else. A soldier sharing his ration of chocolate with a child, another helping an elderly woman carry water. These acts, trivial in themselves, accumulated in Sachiko's mind like drops of water wearing away stone. She began to watch the Americans more carefully, trying to understand them, trying to reconcile their behavior with everything she believed she knew. The soldier with sand-colored hair was named Robert McKenna, though Sachiko would not learn this until weeks later. He was 24, a corporal from Ohio, a farm boy who had joined the army in 1942 because it seemed like the right thing to do and because everyone else in his town was doing it. He had fought through the Philippines and Peleliu and now Okinawa, 3 years of mud and blood, and the particular horror of island warfare where every cave might hide a sniper and every hillside might erupt with artillery. He was tired in a way that sleep could not fix. He had seen too many friends die, had killed too many men whose faces he could still remember in the dark hours before dawn. The war's end should have brought relief, but instead he felt only a hollow numbness, as though some essential part of himself had been used up and would never regenerate. He did not hate the Japanese. He did not particularly think about them at all. They were the enemy because someone in Washington had decided they were the enemy, and now the war was over and they were defeated, and that was that. His job now was to process detainees, to make sure they were fed and counted and eventually released or transferred. It was boring work, but he preferred boring. Boring meant no one was trying to kill him. He noticed Sachiko because she was always watching. Most of the women in the compound kept their eyes down, radiating a kind of collective exhaustion, but this one, young, thin, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to see through him, looked at the Americans the way a scientist might look at a specimen under glass. Not with fear, not with hatred, but with intense, almost clinical curiosity. It made him uncomfortable at first, that gaze, as though she was cataloging his every movement, decoding some language he didn't know he was speaking. One afternoon in late August, he was distributing mail near the fence when a gust of wind pulled a letter from his hand and sent it tumbling into the compound. Sachiko picked it up before he could react, glanced at the address, Mrs. Eleanor McKenna, Rural Route 2, Dayton, Ohio, and handed it back through the wire. Their fingers brushed for half a second. "Thank you," he said, the words automatic. She nodded but said nothing. She did not speak English. He did not speak Japanese. The moment passed inconsequential, and yet it lodged in his memory like a splinter. The Americans brought abundance to Okinawa, a material wealth so vast it seemed almost obscene. Within weeks of the island's capture, supply ships began arriving with mountains of equipment, crates of ammunition, drums of fuel, pallets of food, tents, trucks, radio equipment, medical supplies. The scale was staggering. Japanese soldiers had fought on half rations, sometimes quarter rations, gnawing on moldy rice and boiled roots, while their American counterparts ate canned peaches and spam and fresh bread baked in mobile field kitchens. The women in the detention compound were fed better as prisoners of war than they had been as free citizens of the empire. Breakfast was oatmeal with powdered milk and sugar. Lunch was rice with canned vegetables and meat. Dinner was soup and bread and sometimes fruit, apples or oranges shipped from California, impossibly fresh, impossibly sweet. Sachiko ate slowly, savoring every bite, unable to reconcile this abundance with the propaganda she had absorbed for years. She had been told that America was a decadent nation, spiritually weak, morally bankrupt, on the verge of collapse. But a collapsing nation did not feed its enemies. A weak nation did not cross an ocean with enough supplies to sustain an army of millions. Every meal was evidence of a truth she was not ready to accept, that Japan had been defeated not by cruelty or savagery, but by sheer, overwhelming industrial and logistical superiority. The symbolic object in Sachiko's story was not a weapon or a flag, but a small tin of coffee, American coffee, rich and dark and bitter in a way Japanese tea was not. She had never tasted coffee before the war ended. In September, A Red Cross worker distributed care packages to the women in the compound, and Sachiko's package contained a tin of Maxwell House, the label cheerful and bright, a drop of coffee suspended in midair beneath bold red letters. She did not know how to prepare it, had no pot or kettle, but she kept the tin anyway, hiding it beneath her cot like contraband. The smell alone was intoxicating, earthy and deep, a smell that seemed to contain worlds she had never imagined. One morning, Robert McKenna saw her holding the tin, turning it over in her hands, and he mimed drinking from a cup, then pointed to the mess tent. She understood. He was offering to make her coffee. She hesitated, aware that accepting would mean crossing some invisible line, and then nodded. They sat at a wooden table in the empty mess tent, the early sun slanting through the canvas walls, and he poured her a cup from the percolator the cooks used. She sipped, grimaced at the bitterness, and he laughed, a sound so easy and unguarded that it startled her. He added sugar and powdered cream, and she tried again, and this time the taste was better, almost pleasant. They could not speak to each other, not really, but they sat together for 20 minutes while she drank her coffee and he smoked a cigarette, and the silence between them was not hostile. It was, if anything, peaceful. Sachiko felt something inside her soften, a knot she had carried for months beginning to loosen. She did not yet call it attraction. She did not have a name for it. But she felt, for the first time since the Americans came, that she was not simply an object to be catalogued and processed, but a person being seen by another person. Over the following weeks, these encounters multiplied. Robert began to bring her small things, a magazine with pictures of American cities, a chocolate bar, a pair of wool socks when the nights grew cold. She reciprocated in the only ways she could, folding origami cranes from scrap paper and leaving them where he would find them, or drawing small sketches of the compound on the back of discarded forms. They developed a rudimentary system of communication, pointing and gesturing, and using the few words of each other's languages they managed to pick up. Food, water, good, thank you, the vocabulary of basic human need. But within those narrow channels, something deeper began to flow. Sachiko learned that Robert had 3 sisters, that he missed home, that he was afraid of returning to a place that might no longer feel familiar. She communicated, through halting gestures and drawings, that her family was dead, her city destroyed, that she had nowhere to go when the compound closed. They were both, in their different ways, displaced persons, refugees from the worlds they had known before the war unmade everything. By October, Sachiko understood that what she felt for Robert McKenna was love. The realization came to her not as a sudden revelation, but as a slow accumulation of moments. The way her pulse quickened when she saw him across the compound, the way his absence left her restless and incomplete, the way she dreamed of a future that seemed impossible but which her heart insisted was necessary. She was not naive. She knew that the other women watched her interactions with the American soldier with expressions ranging from confusion to disapproval. She knew that in the rigid social structure of pre-war Japan, such a relationship would have been unthinkable, a betrayal of everything she had been raised to value. But the war had shattered that structure, had torn down the temples of certainty and left nothing but rubble. In the ruins, new forms were possible, or so she told herself. She began to imagine a life beyond the wire, herself in America, in Roberts, Ohio, far from the ashes of Okinawa, starting over in a place where the past could not reach her. The fantasy was vivid and intoxicating. She pictured herself in a kitchen with white curtains, learning to cook American food, speaking English with the fluid confidence of a native. She pictured Robert coming home from work. What work? She did not know, but something peaceful, something that had nothing to do with war, and the two of them sitting together in the evening drinking coffee, simply being. It was a dream of ordinary happiness, and in the context of everything she had lost, it seemed like the most radical thing she could hope for. Robert, for his part, did not think in terms of love. He thought in terms of responsibility. He had been raised to believe that a man took care of people, that you didn't turn your back on someone who needed help, and Sachiko clearly needed help. The bureaucracy of occupation was beginning to take shape, and detainees were being processed for release, but released to what? The island was a wasteland. Entire villages had been obliterated. Tens of thousands of civilians were homeless, starving, traumatized. The idea of Sachiko walking out of the compound into that chaos made his chest tighten with a protective anxiety he did not fully understand. He thought about bringing her home, about sponsoring her immigration to the States. It was a wild idea, probably impossible, but the army had set up programs for war brides, European women who had married American soldiers, and maybe something similar could be arranged. He mentioned it once to a chaplain who visited the compound, and the chaplain frowned and said, "Son, that's a complicated situation. A Japanese girl, people back home might not understand." But Robert could not let the idea go. He told himself it was charity, the decent thing to do. He told himself it was not about the way her face lit up when she saw him, or the strange ache he felt when he imagined never seeing her again. In November, the compound was scheduled to close. Most of the women were being released to refugee centers in the north, where the Red Cross and various aid organizations were attempting to provide basic services. Sachiko would be sent with them. Robert made a decision. He went through official channels, filed paperwork with his commanding officer, and requested permission to marry Sachiko Hayashi and bring her to the United States under the provisions being established for Japanese nationals married to American servicemen. The process was convoluted and uncertain. Regulations were still being written, prejudices were still raw, but his a weary major from Texas who just wanted to get his men home, shrugged and said, "It's your funeral, Corporal. Get the chaplain to do it before the 15th and I'll sign the forms." Robert asked Sachiko through a translator, a Japanese-American soldier from California who spoke both languages fluently. The translator explained what marriage would mean, that she would leave Okinawa, that she would go to America, that she would become Robert's wife. Sachiko listened, her face very still, and then she said yes. The translator raised an eyebrow but conveyed the answer. Robert felt a rush of relief and something else, something he could not name. They were married on November 10, 1945, in a brief ceremony in the chaplain's tent, with 2 soldiers as witnesses and the translator reading vows in both languages. Sachiko wore her cleanest work uniform. Robert wore his dress uniform, the ribbons on his chest marking battles she would never fully understand. They did not kiss. They did not embrace. They simply stood side by side while the chaplain spoke words about duty and commitment, and then it was done. The journey to America took 6 weeks, first by transport ship from Okinawa to San Francisco, then by train across the vast continental expanse to Ohio. Sachiko spent most of the voyage in a cramped cabin below deck, too seasick to eat, her mind reeling with the sheer impossibility of what was happening. She was sailing away from everything she had ever known, from the graves of her parents and the ruins of her city, from the language and the customs and the 1,000 invisible threads that bound a person to a place. When the ship passed under the Golden Gate Bridge and entered San Francisco Bay, she stood on the deck beside Robert and stared at the city rising from the water, white buildings and steep hills, and a density of life that seemed overwhelming. America was larger than she had imagined, louder, more chaotic. The train journey was a blur of landscapes, desert and mountain and endless prairie, that seemed to go on forever, a geography so huge it made her feel very small and very far from home. Robert tried to make her comfortable, pointing out sights through the window, sharing his rations, but they still could barely communicate, and the silence between them was no longer peaceful but heavy with the weight of all the things they could not say. They arrived in Dayton in late December, 3 days before Christmas. Robert's family met them at the station, his mother, a stout woman with iron-gray hair and a mouth set in a hard line, his father tall and silent, his 3 sisters who stared at Sachiko with frank curiosity. The mother, Eleanor, did not smile. She shook Sachiko's hand with the brisk efficiency of someone performing an unpleasant duty and said, "Welcome," in a tone that conveyed no welcome at all. The house was a 2-story farmhouse on the outskirts of town, surrounded by flat fields dusted with snow. It was warm inside, heated by a wood stove, and the smell of cooking, roast chicken and potatoes, filled the rooms. The family sat down to dinner, and Sachiko sat with them, acutely aware of every mistake she made with her fork and knife, of every silence that fell when she could not respond to a question, of the glances exchanged between Robert's mother and sisters. She understood, without anyone saying it directly, that she was not wanted here. She was the enemy, the foreigner, the interloper who had somehow ensnared their son and brother and brought him home carrying the weight of a war they were all trying to forget. The first weeks were the hardest. Sachiko tried to make herself useful, cleaning the house, helping with meals, learning the routines of an American household. But every gesture seemed wrong, every attempt at communication ended in frustration. Robert's mother spoke to her in the loud, slow voice people use with children or the mentally impaired, enunciating every word as though volume could bridge the gap of language. The sisters were kinder but distant, unsure how to relate to this strange woman who had appeared in their lives. Robert himself was gone most days, working at his father's feed store in town, trying to reintegrate into civilian life. When he came home in the evenings, he was tired and uncommunicative, and Sachiko began to realize that the man she had fallen in love with in the compound, the soldier who had brought her coffee and made her laugh, was not the same man who sat across the dinner table in this cold house, his face closed off, his thoughts somewhere she could not reach. The gulf between them was not just language but something deeper, a fundamental mismatch of expectations and realities. She had imagined rescue. He had imagined obligation. Neither had imagined what it would actually mean to build a life together with no common ground to stand on. By spring, the marriage was failing. They slept in separate rooms. They spoke to each other only when necessary. Robert spent more and more time at work or with old friends from high school, men who had not gone to war and who greeted him with a mixture of respect and discomfort, as though he had returned from the dead. Sachiko spent her days alone in the house, cleaning rooms that were already clean, cooking meals that Robert barely ate, waiting for something to change. She thought often of Okinawa, of the compound, of the brief window when she had believed that love could be enough to bridge any divide. She had been wrong. Love was not enough. Love was, in fact, almost nothing in the face of cultural chasms and mutual incomprehension and the grinding loneliness of being a stranger in a strange land. The coffee tin she had carried from Okinawa sat on a shelf in the kitchen, its label fading, the grounds long since used up. She looked at it sometimes and remembered the morning Robert had made her coffee in the mess tent, the way he had laughed at her reaction to the bitterness, the way she had felt seen. That moment seemed impossibly distant now, as though it had happened to someone else. The breaking point came in June 1946. Robert came home one evening and found Sachiko sitting at the kitchen table, her face blank, a letter in her hand. He asked what was wrong and she handed him the letter. It was from the Red Cross, forwarded through a series of agencies, informing her that her younger brother, whom she had believed dead, was alive and living in a refugee settlement near Nagasaki. Robert read the letter twice, then looked at her. "You want to go back," he said. It was not a question. She nodded. "I cannot stay here," she said in halting English, the product of 6 months of painful study. "I am sorry, I thought I could, I cannot." Robert felt a complex mix of relief and guilt. Relief that this uncomfortable charade could end, guilt that he had brought her here in the first place, that he had mistaken pity for love and responsibility for commitment. "Okay," he said. "I'll help you go back." The annulment process was quick and relatively simple. The marriage had not been consummated, had barely been a marriage at all, and the army was willing to facilitate her return as part of the broader repatriation efforts. In August 1946, Sachiko boarded a ship in San Francisco, this time heading west, back across the Pacific to a Japan that was no longer at war but which bore the scars of total defeat. She stood on the deck as the city receded into fog, and she thought about Robert McKenna, who had been kind to her, and whom she had loved, and who had never really known her at all. She thought about the coffee, about the cranes she had folded, about the fantasy of a life that had evaporated like morning mist. The regret Sachiko carried for the rest of her life was not simple. It was not that she regretted marrying Robert or going to America or believing in the possibility of love across the chasm of war. She regretted instead that she had allowed herself to mistake rescue for love, that she had projected onto Robert qualities he did not possess, that she had imagined intimacy where there had been only proximity and need. She had been so desperate to believe in a future beyond the wire that she had ignored every warning sign, every moment of disconnection, every silence that spoke louder than words. The regret was not about Robert himself, but about what she had lost in the process. A year of her life, yes, but more importantly, a piece of herself, a capacity for hope that had been worn down by disappointment. When she reunited with her brother in Nagasaki, she did not speak of America or of her marriage. She said only that she had been detained by the Americans and eventually released. She rebuilt her life slowly, working as a teacher in the reconstructed school system, marrying a man from her prefecture in 1950, raising 2 daughters. But she kept the coffee tin, hidden in a box of old photographs, and sometimes late at night she would take it out and turn it over in her hands, remembering. Robert McKenna returned to the rhythms of civilian life with the same quiet determination he had brought to every other task the war had demanded of him. He took over his father's business, married a woman from town in 1948, raised 4 children. He did not speak about Okinawa or about Sachiko, and his family learned not to ask. The war became a closed chapter, a thing that had happened to a younger version of himself in a world that no longer existed. But he too kept something, a small origami crane folded from a page torn from a military manual that Sachiko had left on his bunk in the compound. He kept it in his desk drawer, and sometimes when he was alone, he would take it out and hold it, remembering the way her eyes had followed him across the compound, the way she had looked at him as though he was someone worth seeing. He wondered occasionally if she was alive, if she was happy, if she ever thought of him. He wondered if the whole thing had been a mistake or if it had been necessary, a strange detour on the path to becoming the man he eventually became. He never found an answer. The crane grew brittle with age, its folds softening, but he never threw it away. The story of Sachiko Hayashi and Robert McKenna was not unique. In the chaos of occupation, in the strange liminal space between war and peace, thousands of similar stories unfolded, romances born of proximity and need, marriages that seemed like salvation and became prisons, cultural collisions that left both parties bruised and bewildered. Some of these marriages lasted, many did not. The Japanese women who married American soldiers and came to the United States in the late 1940s were called war brides, a term that carried both sympathy and suspicion. They were seen as victims and opportunists, as tragic figures and social climbers, as women who had betrayed their nation and women who had been rescued from catastrophe. The truth, as always, was more complex. They were individuals, each with her own story, her own reasons, her own regrets. Sachiko's story was one of thousands, but it was hers alone, shaped by the particular contours of her hope and her disappointment. The abundance that America represented, the coffee, the chocolate, the endless supplies, the industrial might that had crushed Japan's military machine was real. But abundance, Sachiko learned, was not the same as belonging. You could be well-fed and still starving. You could be safe and still lost. The American soldier who gave her coffee had been kind, but kindness was not love, and love was not understanding. The war had ended, but its consequences rippled outward in ways no one could predict or control. Sachiko had crossed the Pacific believing she was moving toward something, a new life, a new identity, a new country. Instead, she had discovered that some distances cannot be crossed, that some chasms are too wide for any bridge, and that the self you carry with you is both more resilient and more fragile than you ever imagined. The regret she felt was not about choosing wrongly, but about realizing too late that there had been no right choice, only a series of impossible situations with no good outcomes. In the refugee settlement near Nagasaki, Sachiko sat with her brother one evening in the autumn of 1947, drinking tea made from leaves they had grown themselves. He asked her about America, and she considered what to say. She thought about the Golden Gate Bridge and the endless plains and the cold farmhouse in Ohio. She thought about Robert's face, kind and unreadable. She thought about the coffee, the cranes, the moments of connection that had felt so real and had turned out to be so fragile. "It was very far away," she said finally, "and I was very alone." Her brother nodded, accepting this, and they sat in silence as the sun set over the ruined city, both of them survivors, both of them rebuilding, both of them carrying the weight of things that could not be spoken. The epilogue of this story is not a happy ending but a quiet one, a recognition that some wounds do not heal but instead become part of the landscape of a life. Sachiko lived to be 87 years old, dying in 2009 in a small apartment in Hiroshima, surrounded by her daughters and grandchildren. In her final years, she spoke occasionally of the war, of the compound, of the American soldier who had been kind to her. Her daughters listened with polite interest, unable to fully grasp the contours of that distant past, the way the war had reshaped every life it touched. On the shelf in her apartment, among photographs of her family and books about Japanese history, sat a small tin of Maxwell House coffee, its label so faded that the letters were barely visible. Her daughters assumed it was an antique, a curiosity from another era, and after she died, they donated it to a local museum along with her other possessions. It sits there now, in a glass case with other artifacts from the occupation period, a silent witness to a story of love and regret, of hope and disillusionment, of the ways in which individuals get caught in the machinery of history and emerge on the other side, changed in ways they can never fully articulate. Robert McKenna died in 1998, at the age of 77, his obituary listing his service in the Pacific and his contributions to his community, but making no mention of Sachiko, or the compound, or the brief marriage that had seemed so important, and had faded so quickly into the background of his life. His children found the origami crane when they were cleaning out his desk, its paper yellowed and brittle, and they wondered what it meant. One of his daughters kept it, placing it in her own desk drawer, a small mystery, a fragment of her father's past that she would never fully understand. These objects, the coffee tin, the paper crane, became symbols not of love or romance, but of the unbridgeable distances the war created, the ways in which two people could be brought together by catastrophe and still remain, fundamentally, strangers to each other. The larger truth this story reveals is about the limits of intimacy in the aftermath of violence. War creates proximity but not understanding. It throws people together across chasms of culture and language and history. And sometimes, in the brief window before the full weight of those chasms becomes apparent, intimacy seems possible. But intimacy requires more than kindness or attraction or even love. It requires a shared language, a shared world, a set of common references and assumptions that make genuine understanding possible. Sachiko and Robert had none of that. They had only the wreckage of war and the fragile hope that they could build something new from the ruins. That hope was not enough. It was never going to be enough. The tragedy is not that they failed, but that they believed, for a moment, that success was possible, and that belief, the belief that love could transcend everything, was itself a casualty of the war, one more thing that died on the islands of the Pacific, unmourned and unremembered except by those who carried the weight of its loss. The coffee grew cold in the cup, the cranes crumbled to dust, and the distance between two people who had once sat together in a mess tent in Okinawa, drinking coffee and smoking cigarettes, and believing, however briefly, that the future might be different became infinite and absolute. The war ended, but its stories continued, rippling outward through the decades, shaping lives in ways both large and small, leaving scars that never fully healed and memories that never fully faded. Sachiko's regret was not about Robert but about herself, about the woman she had been in the compound who had believed that escape was the same as freedom, that distance was the same as renewal, that crossing the ocean could somehow erase the past. She learned, as so many others learned, that the past is not erased but carried, that freedom is not given but built, and that abundance, whether of food or kindness or possibility, is meaningless without the deeper belonging that makes a life worth living. This was the lesson of the wire of the compound, of the brief and doomed romance between a Japanese woman and an American soldier in the ruins of Okinawa. It was a lesson learned in regret, preserved in silence, and carried to the grave by two people who had once, in the wreckage of the world, reached across the void and touched, however briefly, the possibility of something more.